tear, it falls and hits the ground. A tree, it falls without a sound. A bird, it calls and sends you home. A man, he sits in the cold all alone.
Hi, Scott. Welcome to the Joy of
Um,
Sunflowers. Thank you so much for joining me. Please introduce yourself a little bit more.
yeah, thanks for having me on. My name is Scott Beasley. I'm in Knoxville, Tennessee. I'm at home with my family of uh, five right now. So my wife and then three little kids, three under three at this point. So a lot going on. Um, I work in financial services here in the United States, in Knoxville, Tennessee, and always happy to share my story, as which is why we're here today.
Yeah, wonderful. And it's so important to do so, like to have people who are speaking out. So thank you so much for being someone who is speaking. So let's dive in and start from the very beginning. Did you always know you wanted to be a dad, or was it something that you sort of came to?
I went through a lot of different iterations. So, growing up in the southern United States, very early on, it was like, you're going to have kids just because that's what you do. You get married and have kids. And then I went off to college, and probably through most of my 20s, I was like, I don't want to have kids. Even when my wife and I met, we were that young couple out at a restaurant or something who would like look at the kids making noise and just be like, "Oh, we don't want that," sort of thing. Um, kind of judgy and everything. And I even told friends that came to our wedding, I was like, "Yeah, we don't ever want to have kids." And then I'm not sure exactly what changed, other than we grew closer and closer with my wife's sister and her daughter, so our niece. Um, and it just like slowly changed over time until it was like we're just ready to start a family. And some other things changed in our life, and it was kind of a domino effect where it's like, okay, we're ready to get started now. We think we want to do this. We obviously didn't take it lightly. It wasn't flipping or anything. Um, and so in 2018, we told my family and her family that we were going to start trying to have some kids. We went, it was funny, from zero, not wanting to have any, to when I asked my wife, how many kids do you want to have? And she said four. And I was like, how do we go from zero to four kids? Um, and so I grew up an only child. My wife grew up with one sister who's only like 18 months older than her, so very close together. So it's very interesting, like our dynamics going into it and how different they were. Like she didn't have a bunch of siblings. I had a bunch of cousins that she didn't really have the same environment as that. So when we made the decision, we were like, okay, we want to have kids. And what's interesting, and we can probably talk a little bit more about, I know this is about a certain part of our journey through loss, but we've had just about every birth experience you can have, just in reverse. Because with our first child, we actually did a home birth with her, and I caught her coming out in our at our house, with just some midwives and a doula around and our dogs in the background. Um, and then each child has become progressively like a little bit more difficult in the birthing process, including the loss of our third, which is obviously the most difficult. Um, but in a way, I just tell people it gives me the ability to speak to kind of all situations that may come up, from the dad's perspective or the partner's perspective, when it comes to birth and having children and everything. It was kind of a long, weird answer, but that's how we kind of came about it.
Yeah, no, it's good, and like I said, it's so important to share, and it's when we've had so many experiences, it is growing. We grow from it, and there's so much value in our experiences, and we can really help others with that. So yeah. So where did you go from there? Like you decided, you were like, yes, we're gonna have kids. now I want 4, even though we didn't want them before. So how did it start from there? Did you how did you move through to
Yeah.
your first pregnancy?
So almost immediately we both started looking for new jobs that were going to be both more supportive and frankly more lucrative and financially supportive, because we were both kind of in fun positions. And so I know that's not actually maybe necessarily part of like getting pregnant and the journey of birth and everything, but I think for a lot of people, that can be a challenge, is like the resources available, particularly what we have here. Like I look back on the career both of us had previously, and we both worked in the evenings. So what would that have meant for taking care of our kids at night, even, and like how we would switch off shifts and then like affording things and this and that. So honestly, like one of the first things was we were both exploring other job opportunities and what would support our careers or support our family based on our careers. And from there, it was just, um, my wife had to transition off of birth control, which she'd been on for a long time in our relationship and a few different kinds. That was probably the first challenge we had, was pretty early on. Everyone's kind of always, when you don't want to be pregnant, you're kind of scared of getting pregnant. And then when you're ready to get pregnant, you're like, why is this not happening instantly? So I remember, we were just trying for a few months maybe, and my wife was instantly like worried about something being wrong with one of us. And I think there is, along with the loss, the fertility part of it, is there are a lot of pros and cons to social media. And I think one of the pros that we had in both instances is people are a lot more open about their journeys now. Obviously, we're having this conversation today, but even just people posting about going through IVF, being tested for various things, the statistic of 1 in 4 women having pregnancy loss, things like that. Just knowing that it was there and people around us were experiencing it and open about all of those things was really helpful. And so it was funny that pretty quickly she wanted both of us to get checked out and like, have her eggs tested, have my sperm tested and everything. And we did those things. And it was kind of ironic because I think by the time we got the results back, she was already pregnant. Um, it was one of those things, like her body and her hormones just had to go through sort of a correction cycle of being on birth control for so long and health things like that. Um, and so she got pregnant with our first pretty quickly around that time. Pretty much all of that was care through the midwifery, that we were seeing an OB at times, but most of the supportive care was through them. Um, you know, I remember my wife asking me, I think it was with our first pregnancy. She asked me at one point if I was actually excited about it. Um, and for me, I don't know if many other partners deal with this, but for me, I was from the beginning always so scared of losing a baby. And so I was like, it just doesn't feel real to me because it's not my body, but I was like, it doesn't really feel real to me until they're here. Um, and so that was something I was always dealing with in a way. Um, and even towards the end of that pregnancy, or around like 35, 36 weeks, with each one of her pregnancies, she's had hypertension, gestational hypertension. And so there was always that concern for both her and the baby's health. Um, like I said, with our firstborn, we were able to still go through with birthing at home. I remember her being on the bed and trying to get a blood pressure reading in between contractions, which was interesting. Like with a little automatic blood pressure
Oh,
cuff.
yeah, and being poked
Yeah.
while you're doing that, it's just not.
Yeah. Well, that was kind of the beauty of the at home, is she could move around and she was free. She didn't have any other monitors except for that. And they basically
Yeah.
just said, we need this one reading to say we don't have to go transfer to a hospital. Because that was the that was the benefit of the midwifery we were able to go with, was they were very medically sound, and they were not going to try and uphold either your wishes of a home birth or their wishes of a home birth if it was going to jeopardize anybody's safety. They were very on top of it. And so we're always grateful for that. And so basically, they got the reading that they needed, and they said, okay, we're going to keep doing this. And our first born she was born in about 4 hours. From the time my wife's water broke to her coming out was about 4 hours, which was crazy fast. So that was a very unique experience, obviously. And, we were just first time parents. Ironically, if you have a child born at home, then everyone just leaves at like 2 a.m. and you're just left there with no one. And you've never taken care of a newborn before. So that was pretty funny.
Yeah,
Um,
I can imagine, because I had my first in the hospital, and the midwives had to just like take care of him for the first, few hours, because I was just not good.
yeah, yeah, with our second, that was the thing is, we had the polar opposite experience. And when he came along, my wife was like, can I just give birth at home? Because the home experience of being able to move up and like get up and move around and not have all these wires on me and everything. She's like, that was great for laboring. But she's like, then I want to go to the hospital and have somebody just take care of me and take care of the baby and I can recover. I was like, not a bad solution. Um, so between the births, so she gave birth in September to Cameron. Um, and then I don't really remember exactly when it was. Oh, I think Cameron was 6 months old, and she turned 6 months old when the pandemic really shut everything down in March of 2020. And that's also the time we found out that she was pregnant with our second. And so it had been one of those things where we weren't really thinking about it. And then I think she was still breastfeeding. And so there's that old sort of, at this point in our book, the myth of if you're still breastfeeding, you can't get pregnant, because she obviously did. Um, and so that happened. Um, for that one, I think because there wasn't enough recovery time between pregnancies, there were some other things going on. So pretty quickly, they called it risked out of the home birth. So we couldn't do a home birth with our son. Um, and so most of that was your pretty standard procedure of like going through care and birthing at a hospital. So they are 17 months apart. He was born in February of 21. I was wearing a mask in the delivery room because COVID was still pretty rampant. I think vaccines were not out yet at that point. They came out a few months later. Um, that one was your pretty standard one. She didn't have a C-section. She did take an epidural because, various things we can talk about the birthing process. And so then we had two. We had, a 17-month-old and a newborn at that point. And that was in February. And then leading us to, part of the reason that we're here is that then again, still breastfeeding, but I remember in July, all of a sudden my wife was pregnant again. And just I remember us laughing at that one. Like, you've got to be kidding. Like, we weren't upset or anything. It wasn't like oh no. It was like just hilarious to us at this point that we'd start off our journey wondering if we had fertility problems. And now we had two kids that were 17 months apart, and we were about to have two kids that were 13 months apart, because her due date was going to be in March of 22 when our son had just been born in February of 21. And it was just crazy. Um, and so with that, similar thing, we kind of knew we were gonna um like risk out of the home birth care. I think we still checked in on it, and they were just like, because of a particular medication my wife was on, they're like, yeah, that just automatically kind of disqualifies you. And we said, okay, we understand. Again, everybody trying to be, as helpful as possible, or like as medically sound as possible. Um, and at this point, we were on our third provider. So we had the midwives for our firstborn. And then for our second one, we were in a high risk obstetrician's office at University of Tennessee here in Knoxville for most of that care. But my wife still wanted to return to the midwife experience. So we found an obstetrician in the area who had midwives in his practice. And so we were going with that so that she could still do some of the midwife stuff, do a lot more of the movement and natural birth just within a hospital setting. And so like this starts to get into that third pregnancy, if you want me to continue going through that.
Yeah,
I
yeah.
just want to make sure. Okay. Okay. So we found out in about July that she was pregnant. And it would have been in either everything was going normally. And we were just kind of like, we're going to have 3 kids under 3. And then September or October, I think around October, beginning part of October, I remember I had gone to the gym and I was sitting in the parking lot waiting to go in. And I got a call from my wife. I think it was a call and not a text. And she said, I think she said, I'm bleeding and I need you to come home. And so luckily I hadn't gone in. I just immediately pulled out, raced home. I remember her saying, like, I think one of our kids was in the floor and the other may have been napping. And she's like, okay, I'm going to, like, you just watch the kids and I'm going to leave. And I remember saying, like, what are you doing? Of course, I'm going to take you. And we don't have any family in our area. And so we loaded up the kids and took them. And she knew something was wrong, but it wasn't as severe. And so this was, fall of 21. So still a lot going on with COVID at this time. And that's significant because I remember we got to the hospital and we called a few different babysitters that we knew to try and come and just take the kids back home so that we could deal with it because we were in the emergency room. And my wife was 16 weeks at the time, I believe. She was either 14 or 16 weeks. And we eventually got somebody to come and take the kids, but we sat in the waiting room for about 3 hours with her bleeding because there were no beds available. And they said, because you're not 20 weeks, you can't go to labor and delivery to L&D. You have to go to the emergency room and stay here until somebody can see you. And this is all significant because we eventually got taken back. And this was on a Sunday afternoon. So no primary people are working there. And the radiologist or whomever it was that did the ultrasound was just scanning along and not really saying anything. And apparently didn't know how to turn the sound on the ultrasound machine. And she looked at us. I'm holding my wife's hand. We're very tense. She said, "What's wrong, guys? Like, are you okay?" And we're like, "We're just waiting to hear something." She's like, "Oh, the baby's fine." And we're like, "What do you mean?" She's like, "Oh yeah, here's the heartbeat. Like everything's fine." And we just broke down at that point, and she thought it was so strange. And she's like, "Well, I just don't know how to turn the sound on this machine, but everything's fine." I said, "Why do you think that we're here on a Sunday afternoon in the OR getting an ultrasound?" Just because we were like hanging out, wanting to hear a baby? Like, so that was a weird experience. And we felt relieved. We scheduled a follow-up for the next morning. We went in, got somebody. It's amazing to see the difference in people who do the ultrasounds every day versus kind of a generalist thing. And pretty instantly they said it was, I forget what it's called, but essentially part of the placenta had come up off of the uterine wall and it just bled a lot. My wife knows the name of it, but I forget. And so they said that's basically what it is. Everything's fine. They said this is not uncommon. It seems like a lot of blood, and it's not that it's not, but you did the right thing by coming to the ED and everything. So we're like, okay, we feel better. Um, little less activity. And they even said like my wife's activity didn't cause anything, but she just still was like, I'm gonna back off a little bit of on stuff. So this was around, like I said, somewhere between 14 and 16 weeks. And so life goes on from that point. We have other appointment, maybe one other appointment, I believe. So maybe it was 14 weeks and then we had a 16-week appointment. And then the night before, so or the day before our 20-week appointment, I'm up early in the morning pretty much every day. My wife comes downstairs and she's like, she said that there had been some discoloration when she got up to go to the bathroom in the morning. And I was like, well, she just acted like it wasn't too bad. So, well, let's, we've kind of been through this already. Let's wait a little bit and kind of reevaluate. And I think she said that she wanted to go ahead and call the OB on call. I said, okay, that's fine. And pretty quickly, because this was around 5:30 in the morning, pretty quickly, I think she went back to the bathroom and there was a lot more blood. She said, no, this is different. We have to go. And so our kids are, probably an hour and a half, 2 hours from normally waking up. So same sort of thing. I was like, you can't drive yourself. I think she wanted to drive herself. I was like, no, got them up, put them in the car. And she pretty quickly was like, something is going wrong. Um, you know, we probably should have driven to a closer hospital, but I drove to the one that we'd been seeing, which was kind of far away from us because I knew that we at least had some experience there and they knew who we were. And I remember my wife telling me, if there's any time for you to get speeding tickets right now, like just go. And so um, I just remember what she was going through and telling me it was different. And she said she felt like she was giving birth. Um, and the whole time I'm like, I feel like we've done this before. I don't know how this is different. I like obviously there's nothing I can do. Um, and just wanting to get somewhere and get some answers. And so we got to the hospital and I sent her in. Um, and we said, she is 20 weeks, take her back to labor and delivery. She was much more frantic this time than she had been the previous time we were there. So they started to take her straight back. And I said, I've got two more kids in the car with me. So somebody came with me. I think I parked the car and somebody helped me like get the kids out. I think I carried my daughter and my son was still in like the car seat that I could just pop into a stroller. And we're going back, kind of weaving through, getting back there. And I remember uh like entering the hallway where the nurse's station was. And they basically like, why do you have these kids here? Like the kids shouldn't be here. And they kind of explained the situation. They put us over in a side room, but I could hear my wife in kind of a triage room just screaming. And so I took my kids over, and my daughter's a year and a half at this point. So she's kind of like talking and stuff. She would have been no, she's two probably. She's probably two at this point. So she would have been talking and everything. And I was just kind of trying to distract her, give her things to draw on and whatnot. And then like I was worried and everything was pretty surreal. And then it changed when a nurse came to me and said, Dad, you need to go over there. And that's when I kind of like knew in my body, like again, still very surreal, not expecting this to happen. I mean, we've had two perfectly good pregnancies. The kids are sitting right there with us. Um, and so they said, we'll take care of them. So they stayed with our kids. And I went over there and I remember just kind of like seeing the area. And I think I did see our daughter as I came over, but like I didn't want to believe it. I remember it not being what I expected. Um, and my wife was obviously in tears and very all over the place and upset and talking about how she wanted to save her and wanted her to be okay. And she was kind of going through that for a little bit. And then I think somebody had to say, like, no, you already gave birth, was kind of how they classified it. And I remember my wife said that maybe she didn't say it then, but she said it at a different time, that she essentially thought she had passed a blood clot because she'd passed like large blood clots before, and that's what it kind of felt like. Um, and I remember, and I talked about this on a different podcast. There's so many things like you remember very distinct things, but you don't always like remember the right things or the order of events. But kind of the flash memories I have are, um, I remember at some point looking at her and saying, I this may not help right now, but we've talked about it before of like there's a reason this happens and we just don't know what it is. And I remember her saying like that helped even in the moment. And I was like, if this is not helpful, like ignore me. And I don't think that's always the right answer, but my wife and I had actually had that discussion before, I think with each pregnancy of like, we don't want this to happen, but we understand scientifically if something goes wrong, there is a reason for it. It's not necessarily anything we did. And even eventually, not eventually, the OB did show up and he reiterated several times, like, this is nothing you did. Like, this happened. We're going to, for better or for worse, he immediately tried to start diagnosing some things and asking questions. Um, but he was very clear, like there was nothing that she had done or that we had done that caused this problem. Um, and so one of the distinct things that I remember, um, and is not really something you could prepare for, is they asked us if we wanted to hold her. And I had seen her there, and I remember thinking to myself, this is possibly something I'm going to regret to not hold her, but I also don't want to force myself into something that I'm unsure of because of everything that was going on. My wife wanted to hold her. So I knew like let's accomplish that. And so they wrapped her up and handed her to my wife, and she got to hold her while she was still talking and answering questions and stuff like that. And there are a series of other questions that they ask after that and everything. Um, and so we stayed there for a while. We answered some questions. I don't know if other people have experienced this, but the physician basically tried to tell us what his diagnosis was like immediately. And I wish he hadn't done that. Um, I understand what he was trying to do, but I just don't think that that was helpful in the situation. Otherwise, he was like generally very compassionate, but it's one of those things on reflecting on it. It's like, I wish he hadn't even bothered with that. Like that wasn't helping the situation. Um, and so like the next sort of things that happen that are kind of a snowball effect or like just come pretty rapidly is they have to take her away, and they took us over to the other room and they started asking us these questions. They were very patient, but um what was her name, which we hadn't really decided on a name yet, um and essentially what we wanted to be done with her body. Did we want to have I think some sort of autopsy done? Do we want to have her cremated? Do we want them to essentially dispose of the remains or take them with us? And very frustrating. It felt like that was all had to be made very quickly. And so we did our best on those decisions. Um, some of them we wish that we would have made different decisions. I remember I was like, I said, I don't know how I'm going to handle processing this, or if I'm ever going to feel like I did the right thing if we take her home with us. Um, I was like, do we keep her always with us? Do we bury her? If we move, what does that mean if we bury her on site? I just remember saying that I didn't feel like I could make a right decision based on that. And I would rather leave it in somebody else's hands and take what we could with us. Because one of the things that the nurses did was they had some small outfits and stuff that they essentially dressed her up in, like some newborn type things. And instead of just giving us pictures, they gave us a little SD drive. And they said, if you want to see these, they're here. But if you choose to never see them, like, you can also never see them. But they also gave us a little sort of care package of things that she had worn. And so for me, and I think mostly for my wife, but definitely for me, it was like, okay, we have something that touched her and something that's a part of her, and we can say what's hers. Um, Even if we didn't have her anymore. And so that was significant enough for me. I know that I think a few weeks afterwards, my wife regretted our decision, but it's something that we had to live with. There are essentially no right decisions to be made in this process. Um, I remember we basically had to spend the whole day there. We did go home at the end of the day, but pretty much the whole day was spent there with our two kids. And I remember my daughter at one point, my wife was crying on the bed because they asked her a question about something. And my daughter, who was 2 at the time, crawled up on the bed and said, "Don't cry, mommy. It's okay. Like, don't cry." And as always, we kind of use that as an opportunity to say it's okay to be sad and to cry, like, as hard as it is. And she got some hugs and everything. And that was all good, but that's something that, is one of those flashbulb moments that I just always remember. Um, and from there, it was hard to, like, just kind of go back to life. Um, I think we had somebody take our kids for a while so that we could just be left alone, and got some food and everything. But it's like, how do you just go home after that? And I think we had a few hours at home alone before then we had to, like, go back to being parents, basically, um, and be there for our kids. And like the next day, I got the kids up and took them to daycare, and my wife and I just, like, went and spent time with each other. We went out to breakfast, I think, and then my parents owned some land nearby that we just went and, like, just kind of hung out in nature, um, and tried to essentially do nothing and let whatever was going to come just naturally come. We're both blessed that the jobs we had allowed for us to just step away from work for a while. Um, we went to a bookstore, and my wife got probably half a dozen books on grieving and pregnancy loss. Um, as many people know, there aren't really books like that for guys. So, I picked up some other things that were somewhat interesting to me, but there wasn't really anything to, like, start my process. It was mostly at this point, and for a very long time, I was just kind of on watch and ready, for whatever she needed, whether it was she needed to talk, she needed to cry, she needed to have me go do something or get something. That's what I was there for. Um, Being that far along, one of the things you don't really think about is her body did give birth. And so her body thinks, okay, now it's time to start making milk and lactating. And so I know some mothers are going to experience that and some aren't. But, as a partner, I did not expect that. So then it became like, okay, how do we find this solution? Um, and I remember us going places, like, looking for some herbal remedies and this and that. And we would run into people that we had casually told, that she was pregnant again, because we hadn't made, like, a big social media announcement. And I remember I took it upon myself as I would just get out in front of the conversation and just say, like, hey, just so you know, we just recently, whether it was yesterday or last week or whatever, we um, lost our baby. We're doing okay. I just don't want you to say something and be caught off guard, because I imagine what it must feel like to ask somebody how their pregnancy is going, or are they excited for a birth, and then that's what they find out. So I saw part of my many jobs was, I'm going to get in front of it and save everybody this trouble. And I felt like that's something I could do that was helpful. Um, when I spoke on a different podcast as well, they had talked about on a previous podcast, I think particularly for the partners, I don't know if the mothers go through this, but particularly for the partners, there's always someone that comes along that gets unnecessary wrath that they probably don't deserve, but they just kind of walk into the line of fire. And for me, I went to pick up a medication for my wife, and I was in the drugstore drive-through, and they asked if the mother was nursing or breastfeeding. I was just like, no. And that could have been the end of the conversation. And then the person checking me out said, okay, well, if they are, like, this can interfere with lactation and slow down. And I just said, that's the goal. We lost the baby and she's lactating and wants it to stop. And that was kind of all I said about it. And it's one of those things, reflecting back, that person did not deserve that. And I feel a little bit bad about it, but it was just not the time that I could handle something like that. And I was grateful that I was the one picking it up, because I can't imagine if my wife was, because my wife also, it's ironic how many people in the hospital system don't understand, who maybe work in a department where they should understand gestational timeframes, and they don't. Because I know I didn't until we started having kids, but she would call and schedule an appointment and tell them she was going in for a follow-up because she gave birth at 20 weeks. No one would really bat an eye. They just say, okay. And I think sometimes they said some other things, or like asked a follow-up question, and my wife would then have to explain, by giving birth at 20 weeks, that means we lost our baby. So these were all things that happened in the first like 2 or 3 weeks, maybe, after we lost her, after we lost Abigail. I think Thanksgiving came around that time too, because we lost her on November 7th. That's when she was born. And so we would have gone home for Thanksgiving, I believe, before we found out the actual results. So that was a whole different thing, where some of my family was meeting our kids for the first time due to the pandemic and having kids during the pandemic. But they also, that's when my wife had officially announced that we lost the baby. And so that's just a lot of emotions for everyone to deal with, who's like never met our family before. But what is significant is we did do a follow-up with a high-risk obstetrician to get some more answers. So basically a second opinion about why we lost Abigail, because the first physician had said that he believed it was an incompetent cervix. He's like, if you get pregnant again, we're just going to stitch you up and you're going to be in bed rest for like 6 months or something like that. He's like, I have a 100% success rate. I was like, what are we supposed to do with two toddlers? And like my wife having a job if she literally can't get out of bed for several months? He's like, you just find a way. And so we were like, we think we want a second opinion about this one. Um, so we went, and I gotta say, like, it was one of the best experiences you could have out of a situation like this, in that we met with someone who was just kind of a medical researcher or counselor for a couple hours, going through this story. And this is why I can tell the story, is because like I've been through it in detail multiple times. We went through everything that happened basically the day and the week before, what happened the morning of, what things looked like, what things felt like for her, to our best recollection. And they formed a few different hypotheses. And then the high risk OB came in, had somewhat similar rehashing of the conversation. And then around that point is when my wife mentioned having pictures of her, because she had viewed the pictures and like they're meaningful to her. And they said, oh, do you mind if we see them? And we showed them to her, and instantly the OB said, that is not a 20-week fetus. She said, that's at best a 16 to 18-week fetus. And she asked permission to take a picture with her phone of ours and send it kind of blindly to some other OBs with our permission, obviously, and just simply asked, like, what gestational period do you think this fetuses, and they all said 16, 18 weeks. And so I know it was impactful for my wife, but that was the most impactful thing for me, was getting that clarity, because um, that meant that one of those choices I didn't want to make was taken away so that I didn't have to make it. Because what's significant is that the morning after we lost Abigail would have been when we went in for an anatomy scan, her first anatomy scan. And so we would have been excited, gone in thinking about posting later that day to social media and everything and celebrating her. And we would have been told that there was no heartbeat and no baby movement. Instead of that happening, yes, everything else was traumatic and difficult in that moment, and it was a really hard month. But for me, that was like the closure I sort of needed, was the decision was taken away from you so that you did not have to decide, do we want to induce now, or do we want to go home and wait for the process to take its toll and just happen anyway. And so as hard as that is, I just remember, and still to this day think, that I didn't have to make what could potentially be one of the most difficult decisions of your entire life, is like, how do I want to lose this baby, basically. For us, it just happened, and very traumatic. Um, but knowing that it was out of our control, and we otherwise would have had to like say, this is how we want the pregnancy to be terminated or whatever, against our will. We just didn't have to do that. And so I'm grateful that we found that out. Still is difficult for my wife. She, to this day, just wishes that she could have made it 2 more weeks. She's like, if only I'd made it to 22 weeks. Because there's some hospitals that will try and save a baby at 22 weeks. I've reiterated, I don't think, like, while we, yes, would have tried, I don't think that that is the best thing for all of us at that early of a period. So if it was going to happen this way, like, I am grateful that that is what happened. And then out of all this, kind of early on and throughout this whole process, has been that you discover a lot about the people around you, and some people that I hadn't talked to in years, some people I talk to every day, um, started sharing their stories with us, and saying, whatever you feel is okay to feel. There's no right answer, sort of thing. Um, and kind of seeing when we were grieving with stuff. I know my wife got a ton of support. Um, Again, there were a few men in my life um, who wanted to be there for me, but I remember for the longest time, it was really hard for me to ask for anything, because I felt like I needed to be the rock there for my wife and my kids. Um, so I think my grief really showed up 6 to 8 months afterwards, which, with the stuff that my wife read, because there were books for her, um, was that for the partner, it shows up more around the time that the baby was due. And I started to understand that because I remember in March of 22, when Abigail would have been born, it really hit me, because I was like, this is the time when I was supposed to be meeting her, essentially. And now we're just not. And so, just kind of like I said early on with our firstborn Cameron, where my wife asked me, are you still excited about this? And I was like, well, it's not really real for me yet. Like, I don't feel the baby move. Like, I can put my hand in your belly. It's not the same thing. You have an entirely different connection. And so it made sense to me when that came along. I was kind of expecting it, but yeah, especially it was like, okay, this was the time that I can step up and actually do something now, because she should be being born. Um, so that part was challenging. I started becoming more open in my business about when I was having a hard time and not doing things. I would just share with people, whether it was clients or coworkers, like, hey, this is a thing you can't really understand. Um, it's not something I really understand, but there's this grief that's kind of just weighing me down, that I essentially just freeze up about stuff. And then kind of tying all this up, and the reason I was on this podcast, Guys with Grief, is pregnancy then after the loss. So you asked about like when we first decided we wanted to be parents, and it was like, do we have fertility problems? No, no. We actually got pregnant very quickly, and then we got pregnant again very quickly. We got pregnant again very quickly, and so I remember my wife said, she she wanted to be pregnant again, but she wanted Abigail back. Like she wanted her, and she never wanted to dishonor her memory and her importance in our life. Um, so intimacy and things like that came slowly. We weren't explicitly trying for anything, but my wife still wanted to grow our family. And we're in our 30s, and so she was like, past 35, there's higher risk and everything. And so she knew that was coming up as well. And I remember there were a couple months where she like I think got a little bit excited and would take a pregnancy test and it would be negative, like maybe January and February. Um, and it was just hard. And I remember at one point, because I think she was tracking her cycle and everything again, which she'd always done. And she was just like, I just don't want to see another negative, basically. And so she's just like, I'm just not gonna take pregnancy tests anymore. And so she didn't do that for a while. And I remember when she finally did, because like her period was really, really late. And she took a pregnancy test and it was positive. And I just remember it wasn't the same cheer and excitement that she had previously had. And it wasn't really for me either, because it was like, what are we going to go through now? Like, is this going to be an earlier miscarriage? Are we going to go through another 20-week loss or 24-week loss? Like, what does this mean? Are we going to have a healthy baby? What does this mean for the memory of the daughter we just lost? Because now my wife was um, maybe a month or two pregnant at the time we would have been meeting Abigail. So like there was some overlap there, which I think for a lot of people when they go through pregnancy after loss, there's probably a much bigger gap. So it's like, does that lessen something or devalue something that it was so close together? And I see you shaking your head no. And like we understand that, but I think these are things that people just think through. Like, did we do something wrong? They're
Yeah,
always wondering, did I do
I was
something
the
wrong?
same. I was the same. I'm 29 weeks now, and uh
Yeah, yeah.
I've been pregnant in the time frame where I've had the due date of my first loss, and I'm gonna be going through the due date of my second loss in the same pregnancy as well. So in
Man.
this one pregnancy, I've got two losses where
Mm,
they would have been born. So I get that. Um,
yeah.
it's a hard thing. I think the only thing that's pulled me through is just saying to myself, if I'd had one of my other losses, then I wouldn't be having this one. And this child is different from them. And, her name is different and she is different. So
Yeah.
I'm grateful that I'm having her. I wanted them as well.
Yeah.
But if I'd had one of them, then I wouldn't be with her. So that's how I explained it to my second child as well, because she was like, oh, I wish you were having the other babies. And I was like, yeah, but if I was having one of them, I wouldn't be having Grace. I wouldn't be having this
Mm,
baby. And so that kind of reaffirmed it for myself and reaffirmed it to affirmed it to her that yeah, you can't always have all of the things that you want.
yeah. I think my wife had said something like that at one point too, um, between Abigail and Eloise. Um, And that was the thing too, is like when we found out and we started seeing the OB for Eloise, um, I forget her due date was like the end of November, and we Abigail had been born on November 7th. And looking at the math, we were like, well, our first two pregnancies were delivered right at like 36 weeks. Like as soon as it was safe to deliver, they came, they were early babies, like not to the full 40 weeks. And we said, so mathematically, if that happens again, there's a high probability that she will be born on the same day that Abigail was. And so basically for the entire pregnancy, we were kind of geared up for that. We were just kind of waiting, kind of expecting. We were like, what is that going to mean for us? Like, is it going to be happy, sad, bittersweet? Like, what are we preparing for? Ironically, it was the longest pregnancy my wife has had. So she went from the shortest to the longest. Um, and she had to be induced because Eloise was getting like so big. We are like, we have to have this baby. She was not ready to come out. Like that's a whole nother experience. But I just joke with my wife. I was like, if anything, like you made it way too comfy because she was like not crowning, but like was head down in the chute, and then she like backed out and turned sideways. Like, I was like, she was not ready. This was not the plan. Oh, I remember. Like she was not supposed to be induced. There were some medical malfunctions that were dumb that caused her to be induced, and she not should not have been induced. Eloise was not ready to come out, and so that was the other thing is like then Eloise turned into a C-section pretty emergently. But Eloise was born 11 days after Abigail's date of birth, so very close together. Um, kind of speaking to what you said about like if you had had your other babies, you wouldn't be having Grace. Um, we kind of feel that way about Eloise, but I don't know if I want to say jokingly, but in my head, so like obviously I have darker complexions other than all my gray hair. My wife is blonde with like greenish blue eyes, and all three of our living children have blonde hair and blue eyes. And I'm just like, how did all of them get the recessive genes? Because I have dark hair and brown eyes. And so I just remember it kind of clicked for me one day. I think I was writing a post about Abigail on her birthday, and I just said, for me, she's always going to be our kid who had the dark features, and we just never got to meet her. So like that's her connection to me is I just there's no way we could ever actually know, but for me, that's what I choose to believe and everything. Um, but yeah, it was, I think a lot of people struggle with that, what we were just talking about, kind of the whether it's guilt or uncertainty or whatever of having that next child. Like there's the fear going into it, but there's like how do we still remember the child that we lost? And I share this with some people is, they ask us about how many kids we have, and I usually say that um, we've got three with us and one that we don't have. Um, a lot of people talking about, a child in heaven or this and that. Um, I don't try and push that on people. I just say, we have three babies that are with us and one that we don't have. Sometimes I say, because it was a very short period of time, I say we had three babies and four pregnancies in about 3 years, um, which is a lot, essentially. And I still say that we have three kids under three, even though my daughter's currently three. Um, but that's always an interesting thing to kind of gauge somebody's comfort. And for me, it's like, I don't want to not mention it. I always do try and mention, even if we don't really like bring up her name, I always try and acknowledge briefly, like there was another child in there that we had. She was born. She wasn't fully formed. But we still had her and we loved her. And we just don't want to not think about her. And so the people who've been around it in some form, whether it's happened to them or they know someone, um, they really understand. They usually acknowledge. And for me, I like to bond with other humans, and it's an instant connection that, is one of the worst clubs you could possibly be a part of. But you instantly bond with someone and have that connection for better or for worse. That they just get it. Um, and I've found that to be true. And I've also said, so many people were there for both of us when we lost Abigail that we didn't expect. Like just, some people reached out that was so sudden and strange. And just said, there's got to be a reason for that. So at some point, someone in my life is going to go through that, and I'm going to be able to say like, hey, um, I feel like we're all once we've gone through, we're pretty good at not saying like, oh, I know what you're going through, or like it's going to be okay. But just saying like, hey, that happened to us too. If you need anything, we're here to talk or share. I definitely think it's a group of people that I don't think anybody has told me like that they know what I'm going through, or even that it's going to necessarily, just be okay. Um, or even try to provide a solution. They're just like, yeah, we've also been there, we experienced it. And kind of like, what do you need, essentially?
Yeah. Yeah, I
Um,
mean, you can't really say it's going to be okay because you don't know the person and whether how they're going to take how they're going to process the loss, because grief, although we all have very similar emotions and we go through a similar sort of process, we're still very different in terms of how that process plays out and whether we can get to that point of contentment, like in the kind of acceptance sort of stage of grief, and kind of be like, okay, this is my reality, and I'm okay with that. Like I can be okay now, because we're never going to forget.
yeah, we also have a lot of, I would encourage anyone, if you need to. My wife sought out a lot of ways to make essentially mementos of Abigail. So we have like various little framed things of like, there's this sort of, it's a piece of artwork that's in a frame. It's not really a mosaic or anything, but it's a tree with leaves and butterflies. And I think it says, "Look for me in rainbows or in butterflies" or something. We have like, they make this stuffed bear that's pretty weighted, like it's heavier than just a stuffed bear. And my wife holds that sometimes because it's like having the weight of an actual baby and everything. And that's for Abigail. And there are just other random things that we have around our house to remind us, and also to remind our family, because we still talk about her around our kids. They're 3 and 2 and then 4 months, so there's not a huge amount of understanding, but we've always agreed like that's something that we're not going to hide. It'll be part of the conversation. So yeah, just as part of her memory and everything.
Yeah, I mean, that's honoring her. That's honoring, her life and her having been here, even if it was for, such a short time. And I think that's a problem, like when you're pregnant again and it's within that time frame, because you're like, am I dishonoring? Am I not honoring them?
Yeah.
you know and I think it is like a hard thing to kind of switch the mind, because I know, like, I felt really bad about it. I was like, am I allowed to be joyful about this pregnancy? Am I allowed to give into hope? Am I allowed to be happy? Because I just lost, and those two babies were really important to me, and I wanted them. And then I was like, well, the fact that I was pregnant the second time and now I'm pregnant again, like, does that disqualify? Does that, yeah. So I
Mm.
understand that thought process. And I think it is just that honoring and kind of allowing yourself to honor them, in different ways, so that you're not associating honoring them with pregnancy or not pregnant, like not being pregnant. Um
Yeah, as you said that, it made me think of something, which is I think there's something else too. Maybe I don't think my wife has ever like truly expressed it, but it's like then when you have your new baby, so like we have a new baby here with us, and life is still stressful, and having a newborn is still hard, and she still, went through lots of hormone changes, and her body had to recover from a C-section, and she had actually been sick for like months beforehand. She hadn't slept through the night in like 4 or 5 weeks before going through the C-section. And I don't know that she ever expressed feeling this way, but I do wonder if she or other women that go through it, if there's some level of like guilt and frustration that you're upset or stressed with the newborn that's here because they're just stressful. And does that make you ungrateful for now having the baby here versus the one you lost, kind of thing? Like, it's
Yeah,
this weird thing that I think our minds and our,
yeah, no, from what I hear, basically you feel guilty. There's like a guilt there. Like, I'm not saying every woman does, but this is what I've sort of heard, is that yeah, you'll have the baby, and it is a struggle. Like, having children is hard. Like, you've got a
Mhm.
newborn, you're so lacking in sleep, you're still recovering from having them. Your body is just not, it's not at full capacity, like you're not 100%.
Yeah.
And the baby needs you, and it's like screaming, or it's vomiting, or something's going on, or you have to breastfeed, and it's painful because when you breastfeed, everything's contracting back, so you've got these after pains that just
Mhm.
it's a process. And during that process, that you're like, am I being ungrateful by feeling like this is really hard and being in pain? But you're not being ungrateful. You can be grateful and in pain, and hate that this is the reality at the same time as loving your child and being joyful about your child. It's Once you've been through loss, it's such a strange thing, isn't it? Like, you can feel so many emotions in one moment at the same time, and you can feel polar opposites in terms of emotion. Like, when you first hold that child after you've lost one, like, people have been telling me, it's surreal because you're so happy that you're holding your child, but then you're so devastated you're not holding the other one.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
yeah.
It's definitely a lot. Like I know at least my wife, she was very in tune and aware of postpartum depression and anxiety this time around. And she sought the help she needed immediately for those things. But you know, it's one of those things about talking through this is I hadn't really thought about it. I don't even know if she's thought about it, so I'll probably go ask her later. Um, about that exact thing. Like, do you also feel an added stress or like for for maybe feeling ungrateful for now having this baby when you lost another one that you really wanted? So it's definitely a complex set of emotions. And I think, among many other things, that's one of the hard things too. Speaking from the partner's perspective, is like we feel our own things, but we can't really imagine or foresee some of those feelings. And I think from my perspective, if I'm speaking to partners out there, like that's one of the hard things. Like sometimes you just gotta sit back and kind of watch and wait and be available when you can, but you just can't as badly as you want to understand everything. You just can't.
Well, the person going through it doesn't even understand it. Like, we're going through it, and we're
Yeah.
like, and some of it's not even like thoughts. It's not a conscious thing. It's hormonal. It's like an imbalance. It's these like chemicals
Yeah.
kind of cause these reactions, like down to postnatal depression. I had that with my second.
Mm,
And when you go through those things, that it's not a choice. You don't have a choice in that. And it's the same with going through grief and coming through with a child at the end. Having a pregnancy after loss, you then have to kind of deal with whatever's going to come up, because things will come up. And so I've heard some people being sad that they had a boy instead of a girl, or a girl instead of a boy, and because they wanted the opposite, or
Mm-hmm.
they wanted the same sex as the one they lost, or so there's a whole thing
Yeah.
of these things that we feel guilty for or silly about. But we just have to understand that, we got to give ourselves grace for one, and just understand that we're all going to experience this loss differently, and whatever we feel is completely valid. And we shouldn't feel guilty, even if it's something as crazy as being upset that you had a boy instead of a girl, or a girl instead of a boy, because sometimes that can be like, wow, how can you even think that? But loss can do some crazy stuff to your head, and
Yeah.
just giving yourself that grace and that time, because it eventually, if you work through it and you give yourself that time, and you're active in it, you will be at that point where you're okay and you can be content. But you have to be active. That's the key I've found from everyone I've talked to. Like, you have to be active, because if you're not active, then you'll get to your 50, 60, and still be experiencing and still be finding it extremely tough. Like, I've heard some people who literally get comments from people from in their 50s, 60s, and they're like, thank you so much for sharing. I didn't realize I was holding on to it for so many like years, you know.
Yeah. I after I spoke on the first time I really broadcast all of this information of everything we went through on the Guys and Grief podcast, I had never told my family my exact experience. Because there's a lot. And it's one of those things I'm like, I don't feel like I should in a way burden other people with hearing this. The guys in that podcast, really encouraged me that, other men in particular need to hear this story. And I mean, also there can be spouses out there who were the ones who lost the pregnancy, and they like their partner was never able to express these things. And so like giving them some insight. And I actually like I went on to share it on my social media and say like, hey, I did this podcast, but just a heads up, this is not like a cheerful thing. It's very detailed about what I went through. And my family listened to it. My mom and dad, I think, both listened to it. But they also shared it around to other family members that I didn't know about. And I got a text from my step grandmother, and it was kind of strange because we like periodically talk. And she said that she had a niece who had been grieving for like years, and she could never understand because she had never had kids of her own, and she could never understand like basically what was going on, why she was grieving so much, or what this loss was like. But she said because she heard me talk through it and we have a good relationship, like she knows, she's watched me grow up, she was like, that was really helpful to understand what that process is actually like and what that level of grief is like. And she said it helped her see that entire, like her niece, an entirely different light for what she'd been through. And I was like, well, I helped one person, like at least like by sharing my story. Um, so yeah, like, I think it's so hard. And there are probably people who will tune into this who have been unable to share their story, or partners who have been unable to, or that don't know what they're going through. I remember, trying to fill out stuff. I'd be talking to a client and trying to fill something out on my computer, and literally like shaking, and had nothing to do with what was going on. But I'd be shaking, or I would find myself asking a question and not being able to retain it and put the information in. And I had to just stop and say, hey, um, I need you to know this is not me necessarily being bad at my job. Um, I'm just going through a lot of personal stuff right now. And this is before I was really sharing a lot of things. I would just say, I would say we had a loss in our family. That's how I framed it a lot of times. We had a loss in our family. I'm going through a lot right now. It's a little bit hard for me to like focus. So I might ask you the same question a couple times, but that's nothing about you. And that's how I framed it for a long time. And 5, 6 months in, that's when luckily I had somebody really close to me who had been through almost the exact same thing tell me, like, you have to really own this grief and what you went through and be vulnerable enough to share it with others, not to put it on them, but so that you can move through it. It's not like an excuse, but like if you're trying to hide from it, you're not going to move through it and process it. So to your point about being active, is I then really focused on telling people and saying, I need to share this with you. You don't have to have a response to it, but just, and it's not an excuse. I just need you to know I'm giving you everything I got. It's just not always the same amount, kind of thing. Like there are days that I am 100%, and there are days that 100% is what normally is 50%. Um, and I think a lot of people don't understand that. I'll say this for the partners out there is that, I work in an industry where it's a lot of like go, go, go. It's a lot of uh what was it like sort of habits over feelings thing, like just kind of grinding and stuff like that. And or standard over feelings is a big thing. And I understand that there's definitely a time and a place for that. But I'm like, some days my grief level is just too high. And that still works for some people if they can kind of do the basic things and get by. And there's some days for me that I'm just shut down. Um, it's better now, but we all have different personality types. And I know for my personality type, which is generally pretty extroverted, if I'm being hit with that, like there's not a lot of room for other things. Um, for me, it's like I've got to go be outside or find something to do or do something physically active. Um, don't feel like you're a lesser or a bad person if you can't just push through something like that.
Mm.
I think there's a lot of stuff out there right now that says that you should be able to push through things like that. And maybe if that's your personality type, you should, but it's okay to not be that person.
Yeah, there's a lot of rhetoric to kind of like just keep moving and just keep trying and keep going for that goal and just, you're all good and, don't get bogged down in the sad stuff. Don't be negative, be positive.
Mm-hmm.
It's a lot of stuff in the mindfulness space, and some of it's really helpful. But I think, yeah, you hit the nail on the head. We've got to think about what we're actually going through and what our capacity is, and if it's running at 50%, which is actually 100% at the moment, then that's what we need to do. But yeah, I think that's definitely a valid point in terms of yeah, doing what's right for you. Before we wrap it up, is there anything that really helped you move through these seasons of loss and pregnancy after loss?
Um, I think mostly some things I already touched on. Um, Talking more openly about it with the people around me, and not it's not that I was ever ashamed of anything, um, or like shy about it. It's um, I think I always like to be a people pleaser, and I didn't want to basically didn't want to be a buzzkill for other people, I guess, or like bring them down, you know? Um, and that's why I didn't want to talk about those things. But I think it's more helpful to openly say, like, hey, this is something I'm going through right now. I'm working through it. And I always would say, like, you don't have to have a feeling about it or a comment, just like I'm trying to be open about where I'm coming from. And I think the valuable part of that is not only sharing the story, remembering my daughter, um, and just helping me move through it, but it's also you both uncover things about other people, like I said, like people will start sharing with you. Um, but I think also you kind of give them a checkpoint that if they were to ever experience it, they know that there's someone there they're aware of, like depending on different levels of comfort with each other, really. Um, but you're basically saying like, hey, I'm somebody that if this were to ever happen to you, you can come talk to me and it's going to be a safe space. And that helps me personally, is knowing that there were a lot of people there for me. And I'm probably going to be on the list for a lot of other people. Um, there's a picture that gets passed around on social media every once in a while about grief, where it shows like this ball of grief, and maybe some people on this call have seen it. It's like the ball of grief stays the same size, and it's inside of a jar, and the jar is like really tight at the beginning, but then it shows that the grief doesn't change, but the jar expands over time, like through the various stages. So your capacity to hold that grief increases. And so kind of those two things, like understanding that grief doesn't just go away, we're just able to handle it or hold on to it more easily.
Mm.
Um, and just not being afraid to talk about your child when you want to talk about your child. Um, if if there are people in your life, sad to say, but if there are people in your life that do think that you're being a buzzkiller, why don't you just say that you have 3 kids? Um, I would challenge that perspective, and like, what value does that friendship bring to your life? All of my friends at this point, they understand what it means when I say that, and some people lightly touch on it, and some people want to ask more questions. I'm fine with either one. I don't think I've ever in real life dealt with somebody who was like frustrated that I brought that up, or said that.
Yeah.
It's more of like, I think that's what we fear, is that somebody's going to push back against that. Like, why would you say that? I've always been personally met with support and compassion when I brought that up to people. And I think that's a big thing, is being able to move through it that way.
Yeah,
So,
yeah. No, I know
yeah.
it is a tough thing to like bring up personal experiences when it could, because there is a fear that someone's going to say the wrong thing to you. And if you have had someone say the wrong thing to you, especially like a healthcare professional or something like that, it can really put you off talking to literally anyone about what you've been through. But it is so important. And you're right, the connections that you make with people, just telling a stranger, I mean, I broke down in some like Best and Less store, and I ended up having a conversation with a stranger, and she'd been through it 20 years ago. So
Mm,
it was a connection I would have never made had I not
yeah.
actually said how I felt.
Yeah. I guess that gave me a flashback. I know we've talked a lot, but there was an instant where, in my office, we were doing some reviews in front of a room full of people, like everybody kind of touching on what they'd done for the past year or quarter or whatever. And the directors, in the aftermath, they basically said, well, we didn't know how to give you feedback. And I said, well, then you should have chosen to not give me feedback. Um, because their feedback was very generic, even though I had said, hey, everyone knows in this room basically what I've dealt with over the last year, right? Like, I've talked about this a couple different times. Um, mentioned going through pregnancy loss and how hard that was, and this and that. And then there was some generic advice given to me that really didn't take into account, basically, I have to live my life differently. Like, there are different levels of like stress and grief that I can deal with at this point. And I just remember after that, I got up and left. When that feedback was given to me, and there was a very supportive person that was next to me who was like, I'm really surprised that you did not um, say some foul language and tell them to go do something about that. And I said, well, I was pretty taken aback. And I later translated it to these two guys. I was like, look, I get that you don't understand it. I don't think you can give feedback to somebody if you don't understand what they're going through in this particular situation. And the way I framed it for them is I said, I want you to imagine that you love someone with your whole heart, everything about them, but you never actually get to meet them or talk to them. I was like, if you can imagine that, like that is basically what I have been through in the past year or so. Um, and looking back on that now, that's what I felt pretty raw in that instant. I've gotten better at processing things, obviously, and talking through things and being open about them. Um, I would have liked to have been able to say, um, any advice you're giving me or like structure you're trying to, whatever it is, it's just not authentic or applicable to me because you just don't understand. And it's okay that you don't understand. I'm grateful that you don't have to understand. Um, but I think in addition to sharing with the people around you, and like you mentioned, discovering the people around you who have been through it, is understanding that the people who've not been through it, there's no way for them to possibly understand or even know how to act around you. And that's when they admitted to me, they're like, we wanted to be helpful, we just did not know how to, and we probably just shouldn't have said anything. I was like, yeah, that was probably the best solution. We all kind of learned from that, and like, let's move forward. If this happens in our office again, probably either don't give feedback or send it over to the two guys in our office who have lost pregnancies at 20 weeks kind of thing. So
Yeah.
yeah.
No, that's I think it's good for us to call people up on it. I keep saying I'm going to go back to the doctor's office, to the doctor that spoke into my loss and wasn't very helpful, and tell them, by the way, you did a crap job. And
Yeah.
it wasn't just a heavy period. But but I think,
Oh God.
yeah, so many of us would just get like, yeah, too, well, I mean, we get busy, we get caught up in everything, and we're dealing with everything. And but it's really good that you actually spoke to them and sort of called them up on it. And I think it's really important that we do that as much as we can, as much as we have the bandwidth to do so, because the more we talk, the more we sort it out, hopefully the more we can prevent these things from happening to someone else. Obviously,
Yeah. Yeah.
can't prevent it from happening to us because it already happened, but we can help and make it easier. But it's quite a journey going through this, definitely. Is there anything that you'd want to say to anyone who's in the throes of it right now? Maybe maybe they're pregnant after loss, or they've just lost. Is there anything you'd want to say to them?
You know, what you're feeling, as contradictory, kind of like we talked about, but as contradictory as all of your feelings and emotions may feel, they're still valid. Um, we as humans have the capacity to feel opposite emotions at the same time. You can be really happy and really sad at the same time. And um, as much as you can, I think share that with your partner, and to the partner who's not carrying the baby or didn't experience the loss. Don't be afraid to say that you are sad, um, and that it's hard for you too. It doesn't have to be the same grief, but it's okay to have that vulnerability and still wish that you met that child. Um, yeah,
Yeah, no, that's good.
I think that's it.
I will say, actually, before I go, my husband didn't really experience the losses. And it was what you said, which is that he just didn't connect with the pregnancies because it wasn't in his body. And the way he'd always put it in his mind is that they're not a real baby until they're born. Like they're not going to be here unless they're born. His safety mechanism in his brain is very, very strong though. So he literally, he said, like, I'm being honest with you, I do not feel it. I don't feel the loss at all. And he said, but I don't want you to be in pain. So yeah, but he said, like, he knows that there's like a thing there, because he just doesn't see it as a baby until it's born. So yeah, there's plenty of men that have that experience. That
I think that was me before I went through it. Because I remember people around me. I have a half sister who lost twins. I was really young. We had a really big age gap, but I remember growing up and through most of my life just not understanding. And I've got other people around me who they go and visit a gravesite for their unborn child or for a child that they lost. And I'll say a lot of that, like there was some of it where I was like, I just don't get it. Some of it, like to some extremes, I still don't get. But what I do understand now is that we kind of like your husband said, like we are all different and we process it differently. And that doesn't make any of it bad or wrong. Um, it can obviously be a challenge. Like, I'm glad that your husband's like, it's different for me, but I just want to take care of you. He's not saying like just get over it, obviously.
Oh well,
Like,
he did.
oh my God.
But we had this like real talk it out thing, because he didn't get it. He didn't get it because
Yeah.
they were early pregnancy losses. They were within the first weeks. It took me a lot longer to actually pass everything. Unfortunately, we were about 14 weeks when I passed everything with the first loss. So it was a lot more than the 6 weeks that I was actually pregnant, like with something. But yeah, I did deliver something. So yeah, but he did actually say, he did say,
Oh goodness.
but then
Oh goodness.
he then started to understand, and I showed him articles and I showed him these things, and he started to really think on it. And I think it's just like having that communication with your partner so that they understand what you're going through. And it's like what you said, be honest about your feelings, because maybe you did feel it, and your wife wants to hear that. She wants to know if you're feeling it, and and she needs to communicate with you too. But the communication is really, really key to like understanding each other, and having that thing where you don't say the wrong thing to each other. But yeah, we laugh about it now. It's like a
Yeah.
thing. It's humorous, in that weird way where you're like, are we supposed to laugh about this? Like, is this okay? But,
Yeah, it's somewhat of a coping mechanism. That's kind of the thing on the Guys with Grief podcast. They're like, there will be uncomfortable laughter about things because that's just how guys in particular process things,
yeah,
so yeah, there was some of that, but it's also like being okay with being vulnerable and tearing up about some things and having a hard time.
yeah,
Some of those guys have been through stuff that I don't know if I would be able to handle.
yeah.
um, I think I was given what I could handle. um, yeah, I don't think I could handle more than what I did.
Yeah,
So
I told my husband about some of the things people have gone through, and he's just like, wow, like that's a lot. And he goes, I don't know how I'd feel and stuff. And I was like, look, I think if we had some of these other experiences, I think it would have been very different for you, because you would have actually seen, held, all those things that make a big difference in terms of placement, for grief. And that's one of the things that really helped me as well. Like I watched this podcast with Andrew Huberman, and he actually talked about grief, and he said about placement and how we create placement in our minds and our whole being. And obviously with the pregnancy loss, we have that placement as the mother in our wombs, and then if we give birth to the baby in some way, then we've got that placement physically in front of us. And then for men, you didn't have the placement of the in the womb because it's not your body, so you didn't have that placement necessarily. But when your wife gives birth to something and you're seeing it, you've then got that placement. So you've then got that connection. So my husband, I said to him, you're missing that connection because you haven't had that moment. What I gave birth to was a sack. So
yeah.
it was not even a thing. So like to see and have that placement. I was like, so you never got that. You never got that closure. You never got that placement. So when you have that placement, you then have to deal with that grief because it's that placement that has been put in there. It's in your mind. That was a baby. That was your baby. And you then have to deal with that grief. And he was saying the best thing that you can do is then give them a new placement, because otherwise you've got this disconnect of where that baby is or where that person is. He was talking about it in terms of grief, as in someone died who was living, who had been here for a while and all this. But my husband and I had this long conversation about how it relates to pregnancy loss and that placement in the womb and the placement outside of the womb. So yeah, it was just really interesting. It was very helpful in terms of moving past it. I'll be linking it down the bottom. And yeah, hopefully it will help fellow lost parents, because yeah, it was really, really helpful for me.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, I know that was very long and everything.
Yeah, I'm sorry I took up so much time. I we when I do these
It's not.
conversations, it does sometimes take a lot longer than I expect. I usually say about an hour, but sometimes they take 2 hours, sometimes an hour and a half. I think my longest one was 2 hours and a bit.
Goodness. Yeah, no, I'm fine with it. I was happy to share everything. I'm just saying, like, I know that you probably have to do some editing or something. It's
Yes.
like a lot.
I have so much editing. It's not even, but it's worth it. If can help people. And I actually got a message, 2 messages from some women, and they said that it helped. And I was like, it just, when you've helped someone, like you said, like it makes it all worth it. Because I said to my husband, if I just help one person, then this is worth it, because it's it is work, and it is hard, to go through, all these emotions, because I feel everything that, I listen to, and I just want everyone to have babies, and I want no one to ever lose any, and I want everything to be nice and rainbows. But it's a strange experience. I never thought this was what I was going to be doing. Like, if you told me 2 years ago I'd be talking to people about this, I would not have believed anyone. But it's funny how our lives change completely when something big happens. So thank you so much for joining me and speaking with me and sharing your story and giving your advice for people who are going through this right now. And I do think it's so valid and really helpful. So thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for reaching out, Ella.
Thank you.
All right.
Bye.
All right. Bye.
Please note that all speakers, including experts and professionals, express information, views, and opinions that should not be used to diagnose, treat, cure, or prevent any medical conditions. If you have a medical issue, please consult a qualified professional. Speakers voice their own views, opinions, and conclusions, and they may not reflect the views, opinions, and conclusions of other speakers. Ella Rose, The Joy of Sunflowers, and its sponsors may not endorse all or any of the views, opinions, or conclusions expressed.